Hi everyone, this is Ali John Chaudhary, psychotherapist, and I'm very happy to be here again with Fern Schumer Chapman, author. Because last time when we saw each other, we did an episode on trust and sibling estrangement, and we went into the different types of trust that are necessary to solidify a sibling relationship. And now, in today's episode, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how trust erodes. What does that look like? And how it is that we can also repair trust, which is a very important question at the end of the day when it comes to our sibling relationships. So, Fern, it's great to have you here. I'm so glad that
Thanks.
we're able to do this.
Yeah, thank you. This applies not just to siblings, but also to friendships. And when there's a breach, uh, I think it's rather challenging to recover from it. I'm not saying it can't be done, but I think in a lot of cases it's very difficult. And part of the problem is that when you reconcile, you hope that some of those issues that divided you have now become places where you can grow and that you can change, but not everybody can accomplish that. And so what happens is you may have a period where you reconnect and suddenly those old behaviors reemerge and you lapse back into estrangement. And actually, I read a figure that said roughly 40% of reconciliations fail. Now, I don't know if that's an accurate number, but many fail based upon this problem, which is old issues reemerge.
That's a very powerful statistic when you consider that, especially when the idea that old underlying issues do come back sooner or later. As they
Right.
say, if you don't deal with them right, whatever you brush under the carpet sooner or later reemerges.
And even sometimes when you do deal with them,
Yeah.
reemerge. And that's
Yeah.
kind of a pessimistic outlook. So I'm hopeful that this is going to make me more optimistic. But
Yeah.
it's a problem. And I think it's something you have to be mindful of as you re-enter any relationship.
Oftentimes I talk about permeability, right? When it comes to boundaries and such, that boundaries don't always need to be very hardened unless, of course, there's a lot of volatility, for instance, in the relationship. It's another story. But if you find that you're seeing good signs and such, then it does happen. And it's mentioned in the support group how it is that there can be a permeability when it comes to boundaries. Now, it doesn't mean that you give up everything and that you open yourself up completely, but it can mean that you modify certain boundaries and certain layers and such so that you're making sure that you can explore if you feel that the conditions are there. So sometimes those conditions are there and sometimes they're not, right? So
Right. I think what you're referring to is altering some expectations so that you can sustain a relationship.
yeah, in that sense, you're still protecting yourself, right? When we talk about permeability and boundaries, you're still protecting yourself. But yeah, at the same time, you kind of want to see and you're going to test it out to see if it's safe, if your perceptions are confirmed or not, right?
Right.
So let's talk about how trust erodes. I think this is a good one here. So, number one is micro-inconsistencies, right? Reliability fractures, as they say, small repeated breaches, not following through, for example, right? Or chronic lateness, for example, right? You make a dinner date or something with a sibling and they show up 45 minutes late or something. Emotional unpredictability, right? The idea that you're not sure where it's going to go or how you're going to be met in terms of what you talk about and such.
Right.
I think that's an important one, right? And people say that they'll call and they end up not calling, for instance, and that again is a bit of a relational breach, right?
This reminds me of how a lot of estrangements occur as the last straw. In other words, there are all these micro aggressions or micro issues that accumulate, and some small things seems to end it all. And that's because the pileup is just too great.
Exactly, exactly. I think that it's a series of failures that end up happening over time, or we'll call them micro breaches in some ways that just end up building and building. And this is when some people decide to pull the plug precisely because of that reason.
Right.
So, of course, each incident seems minor when you take them on the onset, but neurologically, the brain updates its model by starting to say, I can't rely on you. right? And that shift in predictive trust turns into vigilance.
Well, the problem too, Ollie John, is that nobody confronts this. Nobody says, when you're chronically late, it really irritates me. Oh, well, it was this one time and I'll let it go, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And eventually it does accumulate.
Well, that's the thing that happens, right? Is that when we become conciliatory in that way, or we end up constantly being the ones that absorb that, then again, it adds up over time, right? And that's the thing that happens is that if we're always being the ones that absorb that over time, over and over again, then yes, sooner or later our bodies are going to react on that, as we were saying last time in the last episode, and that it's going to turn into something else entirely, which creates that sense of vigilance that we've been talking about. So,
Yeah, it's really a form of enabling.
yes, exactly. Enabling, that's right. Because when you're giving somebody a chance, then you are enabling them as well to continue that behavior if it's not an appropriate behavior.
And so you have a hand in it, is what I'm saying.
Hmm.
If you don't point out the issue, you actually are contributing to the problem.
Yes. Yes. And that's the thing, too. So that leads us to number two in terms of how it is that trust can erode, and that's emotional unsafety, right? And here we're talking more about attachment fractures. And trust can erode rapidly, especially when vulnerability is mocked. Say you do approach your sibling about something that bothers you, and then they somehow turn it around and say you're being childish, you're being this or that, or somehow not being met with understanding or support and such, or the idea of being heard, right? That your feelings are minimized and such. Or you were saying, we were talking earlier about Darvo too, you and I personally, right? How does that anger is weaponized, for instance, right? And how disclosure can be used in conflict, especially.
Well, I think what often happens is you've activated their defenses. So instead of getting compassion or empathy, you're getting the attack or um, the defense.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing that makes this hard is that when you're not met with that same level of vulnerability that you're opening up with, then yeah, it can make you defensive in turn, right? Because vulnerability breeds vulnerability in healthy relationships. But if it breeds defensiveness, then really what ends up happening is there can be a shutting down. And when this happens again, this can really attack the attachment bond when this happens enough,
Yeah.
especially.
Yeah, it's really sad when that happens, and sometimes you can't get out of it.
Yeah. And when somebody really feels emotionally unsafe, they stop bringing their interior world forward. I think that's a really important one to mention. You're not feeling safe, you're not going to open up.
Well, and that's where you start to get into the territory of emotional estrangements, where, yeah, we're still in touch, but there is no emotional content to the relationship.
Yeah, exactly. So surface level relationship and such things aren't really being discussed. You know you have the emotional depth to go further, but you can't because you don't feel that that foundation is there. So really, what happens with superficial relationships is that the silence replaces the intimacy.
Yeah, it's really frustrating. It's again, very much a one-way street.
Yeah.
One person wants something out of the relationship that they're not getting, and the other person wants the wall.
Exactly, right? And you and I were talking also about how it is that it's not right for one person to carry the emotional weight in the relationship, right? And that can feel heavy when it comes that to that conclusion, right? When we resign ourselves to the idea that we're the ones having to always work on the relationship, but that the other person's not pulling their weight.
A lot of times, one person wants connection, and the other person wants control.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a difference in intention right then and there
Mhm.
when it comes to that. So that's really powerful for us to recognize in terms of emotional unsafety and how it is that can erode trust and such. So number three is betrayal of goodwill, right? Intent fractures. When trust collapses, when someone else believes that you knew this would hurt me, you chose yourself over us, right? Selfishness, right? You acted in bad faith. You did this on purpose, right? So in that sense, perceived intent often matters more than the act itself, right? We're left with the idea often when it comes to sibling estrangement, the impact it had on us, especially.
I think you have to be really careful with this one because what you perceive would hurt or that you chose yourself over us is often somebody else's goals are completely different.
Hmm.
So, for example, you may feel that you don't want to go to a family function because somebody you like isn't going to be there, and
Yep.
somebody else in the family may feel that their goal is to keep the family together. So those are conflicting goals, which can get
Yep.
caught in this selfishness framework. And I'm not sure how you bridge that, but it can be difficult.
It can be especially difficult when you're experiencing this, when people come at it with not the same goals and such, or that they have an ulterior motive of some sort, right? I think this is why misunderstandings can be just as corrosive as real betrayal, especially. I think this is something that does come up a lot, I think, in relationships. And it is mentioned, right? The sense of betrayal that they did this. I can't believe they did this.
Mhm.
I can't believe they said that, and
But
we
their
hear this.
goals may be completely different from yours.
Yep.
And so you have to step back and think about what is the other person asking for? What do they want? And is that really selfish or is it just different from what I want?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's always very important to look at that, right? To be careful that we're not fueling this ourselves. Might be that it's fact, might be that it is like this in real life in that sense.
Yeah.
And that if that's the case, then of course you have to protect yourself. But if this is something we're adding by using our own filters, then we need to be careful about that and recognizing that maybe other people's filters are different than ours and such, or that there might be value clashes as well, right? Some values might be more important for one person than the next.
Or narrative clashes.
Yep.
One person has one narrative and the other one has another.
Exactly. Right. So I think that leads us to the next one here. Number four is integrity collapse. Right. Repeated hypocrisy erodes integrity trust. Right. Moral inconsistency, for instance. Right. Some people that might say something but act in a different way. Right. And
Mhm.
such. That's important to be mindful of that. Right. Are they doing it for their own selfish reasons? Are they acting in a certain way for their own selfish reasons? Are they attributing us certain selfish reasons? Especially, we see this with inheritance issues, right? That sometimes some things are decided by the parents, and when the person that's in charge of that, of course, puts everything that's been decided into play, then all of a sudden they can sometimes be put in a position where they're blamed, right? The executor can be put in the position for being blamed and such. Well, it's not me, it's what's written here. So oftentimes when it comes to inheritance issues, money issues and such, it can often bring up some of these types of situations with people.
Yeah. And you mentioned here rewriting history, which plays into what I'm saying about narratives. Each
Yeah.
of us has our own perceptions, our own narratives, and it's sometimes very hard to step outside that frame.
Absolutely, right? So secret keeping or refusing accountability are others as well too in some ways that erode trust, right?
Mhm.
Because there's this inconsistency that gets brought up. So I think that when the narrative becomes unstable, when really what ends up happening is that the relational reality also becomes unstable. So very important to be able to see how the narrative is and how it is that we see it and such, how it is we can reclaim ourselves. So
And again, if you don't talk about things, you're not going to see somebody else's perspective.
exactly. Verifying your perceptions, right? Very important that we can do that, right?
Right.
Verifying our perceptions to see if what we're perceiving is correct or real, if the other person is willing to have that conversation,
Right.
right?
And checking your own assumptions.
Yeah. And sometimes we are faced with incompleteness, and that makes it hard because if we're left with incomplete answers, then we do have to take care of ourselves and self-soothe ourselves, especially when it comes to that. So one of the reasons incompleteness does happen is actually what leads us to number five here, which is capacity failures, right? Sometimes trust will erode not because of malice, but inability to regulate emotionally, because of addiction, maybe, because of avoidance issues, because of intolerance towards conflict, for instance, right?
Right. So you have to recognize what your sibling or your partner's capacity is. You use the great analogy that you may have the capacity for 100 watts in the emotional realm, but
Yep.
if your sibling only can go to 40 watts, there's a pretty big gap there, and you're not going to be able to, you're going to have to live in that dim world.
Exactly. And I was talking about that in the support group. I was mentioning this to you just before the video, especially about this analogy. I use this a lot with my clients, in fact, to help them to understand that the suffering that they're experiencing is often not due to them, in particular, if they have the emotional capacity, it's due to the other person that can't meet them in that place. Right. So that's really, really important to name that.
Right, and they're not gonna come to your 100 watt bulb environment. You're gonna go to their 40 watt.
Yeah, that's right. There's a likelihood that the person that is of higher emotional capacity may shrink themselves to that level. So, in some ways, watering ourselves down is not better either, because again, that can create that lack of trust or that lack of reciprocity, and sooner or later, that catches up to us. Sooner or later, we start to ask, well, why am I being treated this way and such? And that can question the whole sibling relationship or it can actually burn people out if they're not careful. So it really depends in terms of what it is that you want for yourself. But oftentimes, I often encourage people to reclaim themselves, to live their authenticity, to be with people that match their emotional capacity and such. So,
Right, you feel like you're really compromising yourself if you're constantly going to the 40 watt into that 40 watt room.
yeah, exactly. So, love without capacity can erode trust. So, that's an important one to remember. So, let's talk about how trust repairs, Fern. Let's
Hmm.
talk about that. I think that's important to ask ourselves this now at this point, right? Because there's really three sequential elements that are important for us to experience a sense of trust. Number one is clear acknowledgement, right? Instead of saying, I'm sorry you feel that way, that usually is a bit of an empty statement that doesn't say much. We can say, for example, I see exactly how I hurt you and name that and such. I understand why that broke something, right? So we're naming that and we're allowing our emotional truth and reality to be seen, which is important, especially to rebuild trust.
Yeah, I'm looking at this and thinking, yeah, but I worry that one person is recognizing their own shortcomings and the other person gets off pretty easily sometimes.
Well, it's about also having that same level of reciprocity, right? It's acknowledging each other's emotional truth. And I
Mhm.
think that once that starts to happen, then we're making room for another person, right? We've talked about that as well, how it's important that both people have room for each other to be each other.
Yeah, because I've been in these situations where I apologize and the other person doesn't have anything they need to apologize for, even though there were all sorts of breaches
Yeah.
in the relationship.
Yeah, so you're alluding to unevenness, right? And that's the thing that makes this hard. It's one thing to be naming and acknowledging ourselves. We're also expecting that level of reciprocity with somebody else as well, right? So
Right.
give and give, right? Give and give relationships are always healthy.
Right. And I think if you find yourself apologizing and not really receiving much recognition in return, you're probably not in safe ground.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that that's important for us. And I also think that emotional containment, which is number two, is really what's important here, right? That the injured person needs space to express impact without being rushed, right? And that can mean that oftentimes what ends up happening is that repairs usually fail when the person that we feel has offended us needs comfort immediately, right? We give or attribute importance to their feelings, right? Whereas our feelings aren't necessarily always made to be that important. So conversation becomes about their guilt, right? The pain is minimized to move on faster. And I think that it's important that we be able to take space to name things that have
Mhm.
happened. Those are the moments of vulnerability that actually shape the realness and the vitality of any type of close relationship we can have.
So I'm going to tell a quick story here about the great value of stepping away. I work with a lot of siblings who have not had a relationship in a long time, and I had two sisters who came to me last year and wanted to repair their relationship. And the two had no common ground, and they were just expressing fury towards one another. And I became so frustrated that I finally said, you know what? It's the holidays. Let's take a month break and see where we stand. Well, over that month, one of the sisters recognized not only was she going to lose her sister, but she was going to lose the potential of reconnecting. And in January, she completely compromised, and we were able to find some ground. I think the value of stepping away cannot be understated.
Hmm. Sometimes even just taking space can sometimes help to improve things, right? Just
Yeah.
breathing and taking a bit of space is not a bad thing, I find, because it helps to ensure more mental clarity, emotional clarity, right? To be able to allow ourselves to think more clearly and maybe return with a clearer head and a clearer purpose, right?
I think it's also important, though, not to leave the other person completely hanging
No, of course.
so that they live in fear of this being a complete breakdown.
Of
Instead
course.
saying, I'm going to need some time. It's
Yeah.
not going to be forever. Some reassurance rather
Yeah.
than, you know, I'm going to take time and space and never hear from them again.
That's right. I think that's really important to be able to do that. I think to be able to at least name that and to say, okay, I'm taking a space for this much time, and then we can talk again. So you're reassuring the other person, but yet not compromising your need for space to gain clarity.
Mhm.
So you can work on that dualistically and such. And I think that's really good to be able to do that.
Well, and
So
it's really unhealthy to the other person to make them live in this never world where you don't know when or whether you'll ever reconnect.
exactly, exactly. And I just wrote recently on incompleteness and sibling estrangement, and this is the thing that sometimes plays hard on people is when there's not that sense of completeness and such, right? That they're left hanging and such, like an untied shoelace. You're walking around with no answers. That's hard. Yeah.
I'm gonna trip.
Right? That's the thing. So emotional trust returns when the hurt is metabolized together. I think that's really what's important for us to realize. So number three is behavioral change over time. So apology without change worsens the erosion of trust, right? The nervous system really repairs through predictability,
Right.
through repetition, right? And that's really important that things keep on happening on a regular basis, that new experiences that contradict old fear. In fact, I recommend people that come to me because they've had car accidents and they have trauma. I often recommend keep driving where the accident happened.
Right.
Don't let that take power away from you and such,
That's the old get back up on the horse.
right? In that
Yeah.
sense, so you're proving to yourself every time you go by, for instance, somewhere that nothing's going to happen. That's going to be the new normal for you. And that's important. And in relationships, it's the same thing, right? Your new experiences will help to build and shape and reshape that experience that you had. So the old experience goes into the background and such because you can feel that there's actually behavior that's being backed up in being able to rebuild that in a healthy way.
Well, and that brings me back to my point at the beginning, which is you need to stay with that too, rather than lapse into old patterns.
Yep, yep, exactly. So I think this is good that people can be mindful of this and that, of course, trust is rebuilt through lived contradiction of the injury in that sense. That's really important to name that and such. So, really, really important that we can be mindful of that. So, um, I think that today's session has been really powerful because we've been able to touch upon these aspects that have to do with erosion of trust and, of course, how to repair. I think it's important that people understand that oftentimes a lot of the work that we do has to do with appeasing our nervous systems and such, right? Being able to reclaim ourselves, reclaim our level of comfort in living in our bodies, especially. So I think that that's key for us when it comes to that, when it comes to strengthening ourselves and especially paying attention to our bodies. That's always extra information that we have when we're with a sibling and such. If we feel comfortable, if our body relaxes naturally, or if it doesn't. What is left? Is there unfinished business? Has it been talked out? Are you able to talk it out? Are you able to repair? And if you are, then great, because it will only make things stronger after that, because both of you will be more self-aware and such of the relationship.
And I know in a future episode, we're going to talk about the connection with the body and how to pay attention and how to calm the waters.
Yes.
So I think that will be another great add-on to this information.
Absolutely. I think this is really important for us to explore that further. So that's a good tie-in into the next episode, of course. So, Fern, we're almost out of time. This has been a wonderful episode we've had a chance to do. I'm really happy that we were able to do part two again today to go further with our viewers, especially. So, let's talk about resources. What would be your number one resource at this time?
Well, I always believe in writing as one of the greatest releases for emotional stress and tension. And I've written the Sibling Estrangement Journal, which tells you a little bit about sibling estrangement and some of the aspects of it, and then offers prompts so that you can answer questions about your own relationship. So it's a way that people actually don't have to go to a coach or therapy and can have this private outlet to explore their feelings. So I would encourage viewers to look into the Sibling Estrangement Journal.
Absolutely. If people want to do some individual work outside of therapy and such, then it's certainly helpful for people to do that introspective work. And it could be a very good adjunct into going into therapy, for instance, after
Mhm.
that, since it already helps to gain that level of insight. So, very good resource. Thank you for sharing that. Also, my number one resource at this time is the Sibling Estrangement Support Group, which is still going on. I'm finishing up navigating the stages of grief on sibling estrangement right now. I'm going to be doing that again sometime in the fall. I'm also offering a workshop on getting beyond rumination, a tool for change, which is very important for people to get unstuck when it comes to rumination. So if you want to reach out to me, you can, of course, get in touch and see through Messenger or through email if you'd like, and I can give you more information about that. And I very much look forward to continue to create a container within the support groups for people to express themselves, empower themselves, and always get a sense of leaving with more than what they came in with. That's my number one resource at this time.
Well, I
So
have to say you've made an enormous contribution to all of this. So
thank
yeah,
you.
I'm proud of you. So
Thank you so much. I'm glad that we've been going strong, you and I as well, too. And I'm
yeah.
very happy with what you've been creating yourself as well when it comes to that. And it's wonderful to be able to make that change in the world. As they say, Gandhi said, be the change you want to see in the world. Very important to continue to do that and to make the world a better place by bringing more awareness to sibling estrangement, especially. So, Fern, I very much look forward to this again next time.
Me too.
All right. So,
Thank
you take care.
you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye bye.